By 325 BC, Alexander had extended his borders almost 3,000 miles from Greece in the west to modern-day India in the east. Alexander's army may have been a wrecking machine, but the legacy his empire left in its wake was a new Greek world. Alexander's strategy for ruling conquered nations included both accommodation and assimilation. He often left soldiers behind to marry local women and act as officials in his growing empire. Towns that were formerly Persian, Egyptian, or Indian were transformed into Greek cities. It was an invasion of ideals that formed a hybrid culture that became known as Hellenism.
So definitely there are striking parallels with what's going on today, in our today era of globalization. Today we have a common language, which is English, is the language of trade. After Alexander the Great, you have people who have adopted the Greek customs and the Greek language.
Hellenism was built on city life, and nowhere did this expansion of Greek domination show up more so than in city planning. Whether they were beginning a new city or reshaping an old one, as the empire grew, Alexander's engineers laid it out on a grid plan that the Greeks had used since the 5th century BC.
The grid plan, which was used in these cities, was a symbol of order. Any government that could replace the traditional winding alleyways of a city with a rectilineal grid plan of streets at right angles was a government to be feared, a government to take notice of.
Alexander's campaigns in Asia Minor would create a new world order. Today we call it Hellenism. If you lived in a city conquered by Alexander, you lived in a Greek city. This is an example of such a city. It's called Pergamum. 2,000 years ago, Pergamum would have had all the elements of a Greek city: agora, temples, gymnasium, theater. Pergamum would eventually rival Athens as a cultural center. As a matter of fact, the sculptural style pulled out of Pergamum would galvanize Michelangelo and change the face of the visual arts forever. Pergamum was built on a series of slopes. It was engineered like this. It was dramatic, it was theatrical, and it was meant to be.
Today, the remains of Pergamum stand high above in modern-day Turkey, a spectacular monument to Greek urban engineering.
The city seems to be clinging on this steep hill. It seems that the architects who built this city sort of took into account the topography in many ways, symbolically to start with, meaning that higher up were the palaces and temples.
The city rises about 1,000 feet above sea level, which necessitated a series of complex and extensive terraces. In Hellenistic times, Athens was no longer the power center that it was before. There was a shift toward other cities of importance. In that vacuum, Pergamum rose to power.
In some ways, it's an echo of the Acropolis of Athens, where the temples stand on a hill, a natural rock over the city. And no expense is spared in building splendid temples and splendid public buildings in Pergamum. And so Greek city planning begins earlier than Alexander, but it's taken to perfection in the Hellenistic period. And wherever you go, each of them has a recognizable institution. Each of them will have a Greek theater. Each of them will have Greek temples. Each of them will have a gymnasium. Each of them will have a agora, a marketplace come forum.
The focal point of a Greek city could be found in its public marketplace, called the agora. Here, merchants would peddle their daily wares, and citizens would congregate to discuss the political issues of the day. Adjacent to the agora was the stoa, a simple structure that was the equivalent of an ancient indoor mall. The stoa consisted of a colonnade on one side with a back wall on the other, a shelter providing an open space that was still protected from the elements. The agora and the stoas were the economic, public, and political heart of the Hellenistic city, but its cultural soul lay in another engineering marvel, and was arguably the most important in Hellenistic cities: the theater.
The theater is basically an Athenian invention. Drama is, above all, democratic. It develops in Athens concomitantly with the Athenian democracy.
Theatre was an essential and very important aspect of the Greek outlook to the world, how they thought of themselves and how they thought of the world. And I think to many people's opinion, is one of the great legacies that the ancient Greek civilization has bestowed upon us today.
Theaters in ancient Greece were not only forums of social commentary, they inspired the Romans in their building of colosseums and set the standard of stadium design for the next 2,000 years.
Separate your men by tribe, by clan, such that clan may bear aid to clan and tribe to tribe. Thus spake Nestor to Agamemnon in the Iliad. And those words might have been said here, because one of the great gifts of Greek culture to the world is theater and music. This is a Greek theater at Pergamum. It is the steepest of its kind. Now, a Broadway theater, and I've played in a few, holds between 800 or 900 people and maybe 2,000 if it's a musical house. This theater holds thousands and thousands and thousands of spectators. So how in the heck can an actor stand on that stage and project his voice such as that the spectator in the very last row at the back of this theater can hear what he's saying? Well, the answer is sort of an engineering feat. The theater, first of all, is dug out of the side of a mountain, and it doesn't need a very big substructure because the side of the mountain provides the support for these stone benches. Second of all, the theater is in a semicircle, and the semicircle gives way to an amazing sense of acoustics. You can stand on that stage and you can almost whisper, and someone in the very back row would hear you as if you were speaking right into his ear because the sound would bounce off the back wall. Third thing is that the actors wore masks. And these masks not only function as character, but they also function as sort of a megaphone through the lips. So these three elements combined, this theater would be a fantastic place to come and hear the Agamemnon performed by Aeschylus.
I think undoubtedly the best preserved ancient Greek theater, the theater at Epidauros in the Argolid Peninsula in the Peloponnesus.
Greek theaters were divided into three basic parts: the theatron, or viewing area in which the audience sat; the orchestra, or dancing area in which most of the action took place; and the skene, a timber building set behind the orchestra. The skene and its flat roof were used for dressing rooms, as a backdrop, and sometimes for staging scenes. The theater at Epidauros has 55 rows of seats and is divided into three horizontal seating sections. Stairs divide the sections of seats into separate wedges. In all, this giant theater has an estimated seating capacity of 12 to 14,000 people. But it's the acoustical engineering that makes the theater at Epidauros clearly spectacular.
If you're sitting up in the top row, you're a long way away from the stage. And the person who's down in the orchestra or on the stage looks quite tiny. And yet, you can have a conversation with that person with only a slight elevation of your voice.
In just 10 years, Alexander had set the stage for Greek culture to dominate the world. But empires and their leaders eventually fall. Alexander was no exception. His untimely end would give rise to kings and kingdoms whose engineering feats would be considered ancient wonders of the world.
In 326 BC, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala in honor of his slain horse.